You let me know when I should share my screen and stuff, right? But you're sharing first or something?
I'll let you know, yes. So I
Okay,
think
cool.
it's already running the YouTube. And now I just need to share my screen here.
It's on YouTube now.
It's on YouTube. Cool. And everyone sees my screen now.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this seminar, this fine seminar today. My name is Adriana Maldonado Chaparro, and I'm a professor at Universidad del Rosario in Colombia, and I will be hosting today's seminar. So I'm really happy that you are all here to listen a little bit of a different talk that we've been doing in the last couple of weeks. Before I get started, I just want to thank our previous speaker, Wolfgang Forsmeyer, for this fantastic talk about honest signals and the power of advertising in the context of made choice. It was a really great discussion and vivid discussion, I have to say. And then just as a reminder, for next week, we have Cyril Grotter from University of Western Australia. He'll be talking about the evolution of intergroup dynamics and multi-level organization in primates. So I hope you all to come here. Just quick reminders, this is a 45 to 50-minute seminar, and then we have 60 minutes for discussion. Please keep your microphones muted, and then for the discussion part, you can just interact by typing the question mark in the chat, and we'll call you. Same for those who are watching on the YouTube channel. So just be aware that YouTube might be a little bit behind. Okay, and with no further ado, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kristina Beck. Kristina got her PhD in biology at the Max Planck Institute of Ornithology, now biological intelligence, in Germany, and she got it in 2020. So she is what Carsten we call a rising star. So she's currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Senckenberg Biodiversity and Climate Research Center in Frankfurt, Germany, where she works on the effect of human resource provisioning on animal social structure, which basically is aligned with her talk today. So her research focuses on causes and consequences of social networks in birds, mostly, both in the wild and more recently in urban landscapes. Kristina has a great publishing record with over 20 articles already published in the area of animal behavior. And with no further ado, her seminar title is Social Consequences of Food Subsidies in Birds. So Kristina, you can now share. I'm just going to stop here. Yes, thank you for accepting the invitation to the seminar.
Were you able to hear me? I was just sharing my slides and I couldn't hear anything from anyone.
No, you were muted when you were sharing.
Okay, that's strange. Well, let me try again. So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, thank you very much, Adriana, for this kind introduction, and of course for inviting me to this seminar series. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I very much look forward to be presenting some of my most recent work on the social implications of human food subsidies. And it's all really work in progress, so very much curious to hear your thoughts. And like probably...
I will interrupt you a second. Are you on presented mode? Because we are only looking at your slides not the presenting mode.
Okay. I am on presenter mode, but
Okay, so we
maybe
do,
I just try
yeah, the
again.
presenter and then the share the screen where only the presenter thing shows up. It worked before, so I'm not sure why.
So does it work now?
No, I think you need first do the present
Well,
and then share and look for that particular window.
Why did it work before?
Yeah.
So let me try again with the entire screen. So
Yes.
no.
Do you have two screens? Maybe you're sharing the wrong screen.
No, I don't have two screens.
There,
Does it work now?
Yes, it does. Good.
Okay, perfect. So hopefully it works from now on. So yeah, like probably many of you guys here, I'm just really fascinated by any form of animal social encounters. So be it from simple social associations where individuals overlap somewhere in space and time, up to sort of proper social interactions where two individuals, for example, mate or groom each other. And a really nice way to visualize and analyze social encounters are, of course, social networks. And I probably don't need to say much here, but in a social network, these nodes, they usually represent different individuals. And then the lines in between them indicate some form of social connection. And so this can, again, refer to either a spatial and temporal overlap or that, for example, two individuals mated with each other. And since a really long time now, we know that these social connections have really important consequences for all sorts of different population processes. And also myself, during my PhD and my first postdoc, I started off by exploring some of the consequences of social connections on, in this case, extrapair mating patterns, and also a bit of work on information transmission, so social learning. But more recently, I also started to become more and more interested in not only looking into the consequences of social networks, but more into the causes. So what are the features and mechanisms that actually shape different social network properties? And so I, for instance, did a bit of work on habitat features, specifically vegetation structure, and how this sort of scales up to differences in local population size, and then subsequently social connections. And so for all this work here, I was studying gray tits and blue tits using the so-called RFID system. And so here individuals are being equipped with a pit tag. And then I was using these bird feeders with RFID antennas, and I would just spread them out across the study site. And then whenever a pit tag bird would land on one of these bird feeders, its identity is getting recorded. And based on that, we can then see who is actually foraging together with whom, and subsequently build our social networks. And so that's a really fantastic method to sort of study social interactions in wildlife. But at some point, I kind of started to think, by putting out these bird feeders, I'm actually manipulating food availability for these birds to quite a strong extent. And also when looking at the literature, there are lots of people using these artificial food sources or RFID systems. And there is quite a bit of variation in how they exactly set these things up. So in terms of how many bird feeders they're using, how far they are apart, what kind of food they provide, for how long. So is it just a couple of days or throughout the whole winter? And so I kind of wondered if not this variation in the specific setups of how we provide food to these animals can also impact the social interactions between individuals that we infer. And then taking this thought also a step further. So we scientists are actually not the only ones putting out bird feeders, but it's a really common practice, especially in the more northwestern hemisphere, that a lot of people do just to sort of observe wildlife. And there's all different forms and shapes of bird feeders out there that not only birds, but also a lot of other wildlife profits from. And again, if we take this another step further, so bird feeders are actually just one case of human food provisioning. And there are, in fact, many, many different examples of intentional and also unintentional food sources that we humans provide to wildlife. Intentional examples, of course, include all sorts of willingly feeding wildlife, such as here this winter feeding of the red deer, or also the example on the bird feeders that I was talking about. A lot of animals are fed for sort of religious purposes, such as these monkeys in front of the temples, and then also for sort of tourism purposes. More and more tourist operators actually feed wildlife so that people can better observe them. And then, of course, there are many examples of unintentional food provisioning. We humans provide a lot of food waste that ends up on landfills. Then we have all sorts of hunting and fishing activities, which produces a lot of discards that lots of individuals or lots of species scavenge on. And then finally, there are many agricultural activities that also produce these supplemental food sources. And why I think human food subsidies are really interesting is because when you compare them to natural food sources, they quite often differ in some distinct features. So, for instance, very often they are high in abundance and also high in their spatio-temporal predictability. They are often associated with a close proximity to humans or generally anthropogenic novel stressors, such as pollution or noise. And then also they often differ in terms of the diet composition because many of them can be quite high in fat and sugar. And so I was thinking that these distinct features can probably quite strongly influence animal behavior, including the social interactions. And so together with colleagues, I was aiming to explore this topic a bit further by sort of developing a framework that aims to investigate how human food subsidies and their distinct features can have consequences for social interactions. And so this is our schematic figure from our manuscript draft, and I just quickly going to talk you through it. So at the top, we have again our human food subsidies listed and some of these distinct features, such as their high abundance and high predictability. And then we argue that these features can sort of cause or have impacts on different individual level traits, such as the survival or reproduction, or the time allocation. So how much time do individuals spend on different behaviors, and also things such as their movement decisions. And then we argue that these changes on the individual level can either sort of directly impact social interactions through, through changes in the social decisions that individuals make, but also indirectly through changes in group or population size and composition. And then resulting changes in social interactions can then, of course, scale up to different social network structures and properties. And that can, of course, then subsequently, again, have consequences for different ecological and evolutionary processes, such as how diseases are transmitted or how selection is operating. And so for the rest of my talk, I thought that I would show you two empirical examples or empirical case studies that I'm currently working on, and that sort of aim to explore some of these features or like some of these aspects of how human food subsidies may or may not influence social interactions. And in the first example, I want to focus a bit on the one hand, we have this high abundance often of human food sources, which may sort of locally really attract individuals. But on the other hand, very often once individuals enter human modified environment, they're also exposed to a lot of novel risks. And in the second example, I want to focus more on this variation that we see in distinct resource features among different types of human food sources and how this may as well influence social interactions. And so starting off with this first example. So when I think of human food sources, what immediately comes to my mind are actually urban environments. Because urban environments are usually full of different human food sources, and are probably also one of the main reasons why wildlife is even inhabiting these environments. And very often these food sources are high in abundance and also somewhat predictable in space and time. But at the same time, when individuals enter these urban environments, they may also be exposed to a lot of novel anthropogenic stressors, such as human presence itself, or also things like noise and pollution. And so you can imagine that both of these features can sort of impact the social interactions that we see in animals. And when we have a look at the literature, there's actually not like too much work being done on how urban environments sort of impacts animal sociality. And I just put out here these two rather recent studies. So this is one on baboons in Cape Town, where they GPS tracked a group of baboons, and then they were following their movements when they were foraging sort of in natural and versus urban environment. And what they could show is that once the baboons enter urban environment, they showed on average a decreased group cohesion. And in contrast, in this other study here on wall lizards, so here they were comparing rural versus urban populations. And here they found that the urban populations on average showed increased social associations among members compared to the more rural populations. And so that's quite interesting to see these different effects of urban environments on animal sociality. But what is often a bit lacking is that we don't really know much about the exact mechanisms that might be driving these changes in sociality once they enter urban space. And so if we take this example of the wall lizards and the finding that urban populations show increased social associations, you could imagine that it's potentially human food sources that locally attract individuals and thereby cause sort of a higher social encounter rate between individuals, and thereby increase the social associations. At the same time, it could also be that like for these wall lizards, urban environments provide a higher risk landscape, and that's why they might be aiming to socially group more to just sort of for better protection. And then finally, you could also think that maybe it's simply spatial constraints, because urban habitats are often very heterogeneous, or there are only certain habitats really available or suitable for animals to thrive in, or you might have really busy roads that sort of constrict the movements, and so that may also sort of locally condense individuals in space and thereby cause these increased social associations. And so I thought it would be really nice if one could sort of try and not only compare animal sociality between urban and natural habitat, but then to also really make an effort to sort of try and understand the mechanisms that actually lead to differences in sociality that one may find. And so I was hoping to do this with my current study system, the alpine chough, or also called yellow-billed chough. That's a COVID species. They live in social groups year-round, and they are perfectly adapted to sort of high altitudinal environments and sort of range from Morocco to Europe and Asia. And why I find them really interesting is also because they use really a whole variety of different human food sources. And so up in a natural habitat, so in alpine environment, at least in the Alps, we have lots of tourisms. So we have many of these mountain restaurants or mountain huts, and the choughs, they readily use all these different human food sources that here occur. So they will happily feed on food leftovers at restaurant tables. Then many of the mountain huts, they have also some compost piles behind their houses, which they love to use. And then generally they're quite tame towards people, so they will also approach them and just scrounge for food from them. But apart from these rather sort of remote alpine areas, you can also encounter choughs here, so in more urban habitats. And this is because during the winter season, these birds start to engage in so-called altitudinal movements. And so normally they stay up at high altitudes, around 2,500 meters in elevation. But then during the winter, they frequently come down to the lower elevations and into the urban cities. And what is really interesting about them is that they do these movements often daily rather than seasonal, as many other species do. And they usually fly back the same day. So they will. So you see this here in this figure, that they usually come down in the early morning hours, and then around noon, early afternoon, they will sort of fly back up again. And so the fact that these birds do these foraging, or like one of the main reasons why they actually engage in these foraging trips, is of course because they find lots of human food sources down in the valleys, and most commonly they use bird feeders, but also household waste or compost piles in people's gardens. And so since they do these almost daily movements between natural and urban space, I think provides a really nice opportunity to also compare their social behavior between these two different habitat types. And the population that I studied is located in the south of Germany, in the Berchtesgaden National Park. Here on the left side, you can see a snapshot of our study site, and different shades in gray show you differences in elevation, and then everything in black sort of indicates urban features. And then here, this little star-shaped symbol shows you the location where we were trapping the birds. And so in the summer 2023, we managed to catch 54 birds and then equip them with GPS tags so that we could follow their movements, and subsequently could also see who was sort of spending time with whom. And then, so for this specific question of how their social dynamics change when they sort of move between urban and natural environment, I was only focusing on the winter period, so from November till April, because this is the time when they engage in these altitudinal movements. And so I then had data here from 46 individuals, and in the data frequency, so the GPS tags were set to collect data on hourly intervals from 7 a.m. till 6 p.m. But the GPS tags are solar powered, so it means we also sometimes got occasional gaps of a couple of hours or even days, depending on weather condition. But we could also get even more frequent data than each hour. And then to infer the social dynamics of these birds, we then calculated 4 complementary measures for group cohesion for each hourly interval. And so the first measure we calculated was one to sort of infer the group spread. And so here we calculated 95% minimum convex polygons. And so here you can essentially imagine drawing a polygon around sort of the spatial locations of all individuals present during a given hourly interval. And then it sort of measures the size of this polygon. In addition to this, we measured the median distance of a focal individual, shown here in orange, to all other conspecifics being present. We also had a look at the minimum distance of a focal individual to another conspecific. And then finally, we also had a look at the proportion of conspecifics within 100 meters. And so what we first of all wanted to do was also to compare these measures for group cohesion between natural and urban habitat. And to do this, we first of all had to sort of predefine our urban and natural habitat, which is shown by these really badly drawn polygons here. So urban environment shown in black, and then in gray, the more natural habitat. And then we were inferring these measures of group cohesion based on whether they were happening in urban or natural habitat, and then wanted to compare them. And so what we found, so for this measure of group spread and the median distance as well as the minimum distance, we found that this was generally larger in the natural habitat compared to urban habitat. And then for the proportion of individuals in close proximity, we found it the other way around. So in urban environment, a focal individual had on average more conspecifics within close proximity compared to the natural habitat. And so this was really interesting for us to see that in the alpine chaff, they apparently seem to exhibit a stronger group cohesion once they are in urban habitat. And so subsequently, we then wanted to find out more about why this may potentially be. And so that's why I want to come back to this figure here, because if you compare these two polygons, you can see that urban space is actually quite a bit smaller than the natural space. And so you could imagine that differences in the measures of group cohesion may simply be a result of spatial constraints. And to investigate this, what we did was just to calculate a bunch of random spatial locations within each of these categories, like habitat categories. And then we recalculated our 4 measures of group cohesion. And then subsequently compared the observed to the randomly generated measures. And I'm only showing now results for group spread here. But essentially, so what you can see in green are the observed values, and then in gray, the randomly generated ones. And what you see is that also for these randomly generated data, we see that the ones in the natural habitat, so the measures for group spread were generally larger compared to those in the urban habitat. But then if we look within each habitat type, we see that the observed values are considerably smaller than what we generated with the randomly sampled data. And also when we actually have a look at the magnitude of the difference between the observed natural and observed urban, it's really badly shown in this figure, but essentially the difference between those two is much larger than the difference between the randomly generated natural values compared to the randomly generated ones in the urban values. And so I think this indicates that spatial constraints can for sure partly influence measures of group cohesion, but given the fact that the observed values are so much smaller and also that this magnitude of the difference is so much larger in our observed values, indicates that there must also be other features that contribute to these differences in group cohesion. And so then there's a next step. I thought, well, potentially it's maybe the presence of a couple of human food sources that maybe locally attract individuals and might thereby cause changes in group cohesion. And to investigate this, we first had to sort of locate the different human food sources. And so within the urban space, we had sort of a predefined area, and then we would just do transects, recording all the presence of all sorts of human food sources, mostly including bird feeders or compost piles, indicated by these black crosses. And also then in the natural space, so in alpine habitat, we knew of the opening hours of 4 main mountain restaurants that would sort of provide food also during the winter months. And these colored dots, they simply show you the GPS locations of our choughs, and the color just indicates sort of the spatial overlap, so how many data you essentially get at a given location. So the darker red, the more points at a given location. And then what we did was we drew a radius around each of these human food sources. And then for those 3 measures on group cohesion that were based on a focal individual, those we then sort of assigned as either falling within this radius and thus probably being associated with the human food source, and then comparing these 2 group measures that were outside of this radius and probably not associated with a human food source. And that way we had a really nice data set to not only compare then urban versus the natural context, but even then within each of these habitat types, we could then differentiate between locations of human food availability and those without. And so what we found, so for the median distance, we found that there was no difference both in urban but also in natural space between locations with human food and those locations without. For the minimum distance, this somewhat changes. So again, we found no difference in the urban context. But then in natural habitats, we saw that on average, the minimum distance to a conspecific was smaller when they were close to a human food source. And then finally, for the proportion of individuals within 100 meters, we see something similar. So again, no difference in the urban context, but in the natural habitat, individuals on average had a larger proportion of individuals close by when they were also in close proximity to a human food source. So now just to very briefly sum this all up, So we could see that in the alpine choughs, they tend to show a higher group cohesion in urban habitat compared to natural habitat. Then some of this group cohesion might partly be explained by spatial constraints, but there for sure must be other features explaining these differences. And then when we focus within each of these urban spaces, within each of these habitat categories, so in urban space, the cohesion was not different at locations associated with human food and those without. And in natural space, cohesion was higher at locations associated with human food. And so that potentially suggests some context-specific effects of human food on group cohesion. And so I'm speculating that the fact that we see this strong group cohesion in urban environments is likely driven by elevated risks. And that's because I think that alpine choughs might encounter more predators once they're in urban space and at lower elevations, because up at high elevations, they actually hardly have any predators around. They also have more competitors in terms of carrion crows being present in the cities and sort of absent in their natural space. And also what changes quite a bit is actually the attitude of people towards the choughs. Because up in alpine habitat, people really love choughs. They're really fun to interact. You can take pictures with them and feed them. But then once you move to the urban spaces, this actually changes quite a bit. And especially, house owners where the choughs frequently go, they may put up bird feeders that are actually intended to feed other bird species, and so they might get quite annoyed with them. They, of course, poop a lot. They may destroy vegetation in your garden, and so we see a lot of people trying to chase them away. And I also put out this headline here from a local newspaper, because during the time when we were studying them there, one of them got shot, which is illegal, but which I think kind of nicely demonstrates that humans suddenly become quite a high risk for choughs in urban environments. And yeah, so much for the first example. In the second case study, I would like to now focus on this distinct variation in resource features when comparing different human food subsidies and the effects that they may have on social interactions. And so to do this, I want to first go back to the very base of how we actually define a social interaction. So for an interaction to take place, we obviously need some overlap of two individuals in space and time. And if we would now think of increasing the chances of social interactions, you need to think of ways in sort of increasing the degree of spatial overlap and increasing the degree of temporal overlap. And you can imagine if both of this is really high, then you have good chances that individuals may, socially encounter each other. Whereas if both of this is really low, then the chances of meeting others is maybe rather low. And if we now think about our human food subsidies, when we look into the literature, very often they're just simply classified as high in abundance and high in predictability. And that's why they may, increase social encounters. But it's very often not quantified. And I also wonder whether this, might be true. Because if I go back to this figure here, showing all these different examples, we can actually see that they differ in so much more than just the abundance and their predictability. So for instance, they change quite a bit in terms of the ephemerality, so the temporal availability of food. Is it constantly available, or is it maybe short-lived and only fleeting? Then, of course, it varies in predictability. Some of them are highly predictable in space, others not so much. Some are predictable in time, others not so much. Then, of course, we get changes in abundance, where some provide really high quantities of food and others only very little. And then, of course, we get quite some variation in the quality of the food source as well, because sometimes you get really a highly desired food source, whereas other examples, they do provide food, but it's actually not of high quality and not very desirable. And so you can imagine that these distinct features can then also strongly impact social encounter probabilities. So if we go back to this figure and we think about a resource that would sort of increase the degree of spatial overlap, we would need a resource that is at least somewhat predictable in space, ideally one that is also highly abundant, and then we could even further increase spatial overlap if it's sort of high quality and thereby is attracting lots of individuals. And then in terms of the temporal overlap, we need, of course, a resource that is predictable in time, ideally also one that is of high quality. And then you could think that you may further boost this by having a resource that is only short-lived, because it can then sort of condense the temporal window during which individuals may visit a given resource. And just picking out here two examples, so the landfill and then this case of wildlife feeding here, where these monkeys are being fed in front of these temples. You could say that both are to some extent predictable in space and time, but then in terms of their ephemerality, abundance, and the quality of the food, they potentially vary quite a bit. Because the landfill provides somewhat a constant resource, it's potentially providing food in large amounts, but maybe of lower quality. And the wildlife feeding is rather short-lived. It provides a lower amount, but it's usually of very high quality, because people really want to provide something very nice to animals. And so in terms of, social encounter probabilities, you could imagine that the wildlife feeding is maybe condensing more individuals in time and space, thereby increasing social encounters between individuals. And so I thought it would be really nice if one could actually investigate this with an empirical example. And to do this, I studied another corvid species, the common raven. They are widely distributed across the northern hemisphere. You can mostly differentiate here between nomadic juveniles and territorial adults. And they exhibit a really strong fission-fusion dynamic, and can generally be classified as really, as foraging generalists, because their natural food sources are mostly large predator kills, such as by wolves or bears. But we also know that they heavily use a whole variation of different human food subsidies, such as landfills, roadkills, urban waste, these sewage ponds, or agricultural properties, such as these sheep farms and so on. And so the population that I then started to study is based here in Yellowstone National Park. And so Matthias Loreto, he started GPS tagging ravens there in 2019. And in addition to this, they started to do a really detailed resource monitoring by really sort of following the raven movements and looking at each of these distinct locations, what kind of resources do they feed on. So we have some really nice information about this here. And in addition to this, there is also some GPS tracking of wolf packs and cougars going on since quite some time now, which is mostly led by Daniel Stahler nowadays. And in association to this project, they do a very detailed carcass monitoring. And so this provided me with a really nice data set of 61 individual GPS tag ravens. I was focusing on the study period between October 19 till March 21, because this is the time when they were also doing this detailed resource monitoring. GPS tags were set to collect data up to 30 minutes throughout the day. But again, also these are solar charged, so sometimes you will get these occasional gaps in data. And then based on all this resource information, I could then sort of come up with 6 different resource categories, 4 of which could be attributed to human food sources. These included urban waste, such as landfills, then roadkill, agriculture, so things like cattle farms. And then we had one category called hunting gut piles. And so this refers to the fact that in Yellowstone, so not within the national park, but just sort of outside of the border, people engage in hunting activities, but only sort of at the beginning of October until the end of March, beginning of April. And then once people shoot an animal in the field, what they do is that they usually cut it open, remove the guts, and then only take the meat home. And so these guts are a highly desired food source for the ravens that they very readily exploit. And then we also had 2 categories for natural food sources. So one of which was the carcasses. So these mostly refer to all these large predator kills, such as by wolves. And then we also had one category that we called natural dispersed. And it mostly refers to insects, because in summer, ravens actually feed quite a lot on insects. And in the national park, you often get these bursts in insect hatching. So this picture shows you a salmon fly, and you often have distinct locations at rivers or any sorts of water bodies where insects suddenly emerge in really huge numbers. And then I kind of wanted to see how, like, if I'm looking into the social encounters between ravens, how would they sort of change or how would they relate to all these different resource categories? And to do this, I first of all defined a social encounter as sort of 2 ravens being within 100 meters of each other. And then for each of these identified social encounters, I then also classified it to a given context. So whether it was related to a human food source or a natural one. And then also I had these 2 other categories. So the first one referring to the roosting sites. That's because the ravens, when they go to sleep, they really like to gather together somewhere at a couple of trees. And so all the encounters sort of before sunrise and after sunset were sort of attributed to these roosting sites. And then I also had a category for sort of all other social encounters that I could not attribute towards any of these other 3 categories. And so what I found, so here in this figure, you will see the proportion of social encounters for each individual separated out for these different resource categories. And so here in dark gray, you can see all the human food sources. In light gray, the natural food sources. And then in white, so the roosting sites and other cases. And what was really interesting for us to see is that apparently these gut piles really strongly drive social encounters between individuals, followed by urban waste and also roosting sites contributed quite somewhat to the proportion of social encounters. And so given that, so I was mentioning that these gut piles, they are not available throughout the whole year because hunting season is somewhat restricted to just the winter period. So it only happens from like beginning of October to end of March, beginning of April. And so that's why I also wanted to have a look at this sort of separated out across the year. And this is what you can see here. So now I made a plot once for the urban food sources and then all the natural categories. And I think what you can see is that overall across the year, there is a tiny bit of variation, but not too much. But what is really obvious is this really strong peak in March, referring to the gut piles. And I was really a bit puzzled first of why this may be, because hunting season starts somewhat in October, November. And why do we see this really strong peak in March? And so it turns out that in March, you're only allowed to hunt, or that's the only time when you're allowed to hunt bison. And so how this usually happens is that lots of hunters will go out in March and then shoot many bison. So within this month, they can shoot hundreds or even up to 1,000 bison within sort of the Yellowstone area. And then, of course, hunters only take the meat, but leave all the guts in the field. And I think this creates then just a food source that is very high in abundance to the ravens, very high in quality because it's, the most favorite thing to them. It's also somewhat predictable in space and time. And it's also temporally fleeting in the sense that it only happens during this short amount of time. And so I think that all these features together and probably also interspecific competition may sort of drive this increase in social encounters that we see. And we can also see that this somewhat translates into social network properties. So I only recently started working on this, but so here's a measure of network edge density. So it gives you a measure of, so what's the proportion of realized social network connections compared to all available ones. And we see that also in March, we get sort of the highest value in network density, but also generally sort of in winter, we see very high values in density because winter is also the season where they mostly use human food sources. So now just to very quickly sum this up here as well. So when we come back to this figure again, and if we would sort of fill in the different food categories. So if we think of a roadkill or also a natural carcass by a larger predator, I guess this sort of provides less opportunities for social encounters, simply because it's not so much predictable in space and time. In contrast, when we have a look at a landfill, for example, this is very predictable in space. So it may, creates a very strong degree in spatial overlap. But in terms of the temporal overlap, since it's a resource that is constantly available and potentially of less food quality, it's maybe not driving the temporal overlap to such a large extent. And then when we think about these hunting gut piles, They are, of course, a bit less spatially predictable, but they actually do often happen in very distinct locations where the hunters like to go. But they may actually provide quite a high degree of temporal overlap, because they're also somewhat temporally predictable, but then at the same time also constrained in the sense that they only happen during a short amount of time, and provide this really high quality food source. And so what we can conclude from this is that human food sources, and so specifically these hunting gut piles and urban waste, but also these roosting sites, seem to influence raven social encounters to quite some extent. I think it also shows nicely that considering these distinct resource food features of human food sources is important, because it can shape social encounters differently. And so if we have a food source that is predictable in space and time, and at the same time abundant and of high quality and potentially also ephemeral, that this can sort of create really most opportunities for social encounters. And then now you can, of course, think of consequences of this for disease transmission or also lead poisoning, especially when we think about these different gut piles. And so now at the end, I would just quickly come back to the schematic figure from our review paper. And I hope that during my talk today, I could sort of demonstrate that considering human food subsidies is kind of important when you sort of investigate effects on social interactions. And so, yeah, with this, I'd really like to thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Kristina, for such a great talk. Okay, so we open the floor to questions, and you can, I think you can click on the stop share and then we stop seeing your.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, cool.
There.
Okay. So we have a first question from Amy, and just as a reminder, just to state your name, your affiliation, and very briefly where you work on or what you work on, and just to create a little bit of a community here. Amy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for a brilliant talk. I'm Emmy Schlicht. I'm a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for Biological Intelligence in Zivilien, and I work mainly on mating systems, parental care related to extra paternity, mainly in blue tits. I have a quick question. It was all very fascinating. Thanks a lot. But I have a quick question about the chart distribution pattern of the GPS points, because you had these red areas and most of them were either urban or the alpine restaurants. But then there was this one area which is not associated with that. And first of all, I'd like to ask if you know what's going on there. And second, if you could use that as sort of another control to see what the distances and the minimal distances and the median distances and the interaction parameters are in that area specifically, just as another comparison to the urban or food affected environment.
Yeah, I just quickly gonna share again, if that hopefully works. How did share? So you can see my screen again. Right. And so I guess you're referring to this bit here, right? Yeah. So that's actually another urban space. So I was, for the sake of this talk, just focusing on this main area up here, because this is sort of a bigger urban space, a bigger city that these birds are using. And also for the sake of, like defining or analyzing some of these features, it was easier to sort of focus just on this one urban location. Let me just, I think I also have another slide somewhere up here. Yeah, so that shows you again, so this is essentially like a smaller mountain village that these birds also like to use. And what happens like during these altitudinal movements, I think I have some example tracks here. So these lines, they show you an example movement trajectory of two individuals. So they usually start off in the early morning, come down and visit this one urban area up here. And then on their way back up to the mountain, they do usually a little stopover at this urban site here as well, until they sort of move back up to higher altitudes again. And then they sometimes visit these other two locations. I'm just gonna stop sharing again. So yeah, essentially I like for comparisons, I couldn't really use that in that way, and the hotspot is just because it's another urban site that they really sort of like to use, and it's really interesting because they're highly routinized and very site faithful in these locations that they visit. So you can see that they pretty much daily move down to this one urban site and then move to the other one. And so, yeah, it's really interesting to see these highly routinized movements. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
It's really fascinating. Thanks a lot. Super cool.
Sure.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, so now we have Perfect.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Kristina. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. Yes.
Thanks.
So I have a couple of questions, but okay, for now I'll ask one. So I wanted to ask, like for example, from an evolutionary perspective, did you see any signs of the like for example signs from the human provided subsidies such that they show behavioral traits like to the base, like for example boldness and stuff?
So you mean like the human side of things, so
Yes,
whether
yes.
they are
Like,
certain traits? Yeah, so unfortunately I never engaged in studying the human side of things. I'd be very interested in starting to do so. So I thought about, doing some surveys on, asking people different questions, about whether, they're house owners in the cities and or also up in alpine environment, if they're tourists or not, because I can imagine that for sure some of these backgrounds of people definitely affects the attitudes towards them, or towards the choughs, because also especially in urban space, when we talk to people, we see quite a lot of variation. So either we see people trying to chase them away and being really negative of like, why are you studying them and why they're interesting? Or if you're studying them, then tell me, how do I get rid of them and things like that. Or they're really fascinated and like, oh yeah, they're so much fun to watch. And so I think for sure that the majority of people that are not happy about the choughs are usually the ones that also get some negative effects of in terms of them destroying, the vegetation in their garden or pooping on their houses and things like that. But yeah, I haven't quantified the human side of things here. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So just a follow-up question, like from the like for example, if you sort of experience a decline in these food subsidies, like do you sort of like observe the birds like reverting back to like their natural like sort of environment in terms of this foraging grounds and stuff?
Yeah, so what we see generally, like in both the choughs and the ravens, actually, is that they use human food sources much more during the winter. And then during the summer, this really decreases, and then both species rely mostly on insects. And in terms of the alpine chaff, I also think that the main reason why they even engage in these altitudinal movements and why they come down is because of the lack of natural or general food sources up at high altitudes. Because I know of examples. So there's one person in Spain, and they started GPS tracking a couple of choughs there as well. And this location is much less touristy. And so there, the choughs, they don't engage in these altitudinal movements. So also during the winter, they stay up in their natural habitat. And what you can see them mostly feeding on is berries. And so that's sort of the natural food source of choughs in winter, actually. So juniper berries and stuff like that. And it's pretty much absent from our study site. And so they hardly have any natural food sources. Also at this study site, we have quite some amounts of snow in winter. So I think even if there would sometimes be some berry bushes, they could just be buried by snow. And then also in terms of the human food sources that are available up in alpine environment, I think they're just not enough for them to actually stay up there for the whole time, because there is also examples or just like reports of some choughs, I think in Switzerland, where you have sometimes these massive skiing resorts and so really lots of different human food sources, where they also do not engage in altitudinal movements, probably because they have enough up there. And so, yeah, I think it's really sort of the food absence that probably drives the birds down into urban environments at the location where I study them.
Okay, I will ask another question. Let me give other people a chance.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Or I can ask. I can go ahead.
Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
sure. I'm fine
All
with
right.
that.
So you spoke about the altered diet composition. So I was wondering, like, for example, how do the differences, for example, in terms of the food quality or the nutritional composition of the food sort of affect the survival of the birds, and also, like, for example, the reproductive success? Do you have an idea?
What do you mean the reproductive success? I thought you referred to how I classify these different resource types, no? Or
I mean,
like
like
I
the food
didn't.
the nutritional composition of the food subsidies compared to those like from the natural environment. For example, the insect. How do they affect like reproductive success, and also like the survival of the juveniles, for example? Like, have an
Yeah.
idea about.
Yeah, I wish I would know. So unfortunately, I do not. And when I started this project on alpine choughs, I was really hoping to be able to get some data on their reproductive success. But it turns out it's really difficult because they breed in cliffs. And so since we GPS tag them, and then when they go into the cliffs, we actually don't really find their roosting or their breeding nesting sites. And also they breed in really steep cliffs. So I'm not a climber, so I would, I don't know, like it would be really difficult to actually find the nest locations and then to be able to monitor breeding success. And similarly for ravens, it's much harder to actually catch them, and I mean, there we have a bit of better data in terms of some, I think it was like 18 birds of them are territorial, and that's also breeder. And so you could potentially have a look at their reproductive success, but I don't think that they have too much data about that. But it would be great to actually infer, especially because we see quite a lot of individual differences in how they use human food sources, and how this could, subsequently influence survival and reproductive success. I guess what is tricky also a bit is that in summer, some of them completely stop consuming human food sources because they just rely so much on the natural food. But yeah, maybe what I can add, I mean, in the choughs, I think in terms of, so we cannot say much about their reproductive success, unfortunately. But what I believe is that in terms of their survival for this local population, that the human food subsidies, even though they might not be good for sort of their general body condition or their health, I think it's quite a crucial aspect in terms of the survival of many of these individuals. And so I imagine that specifically for this local population that I study, if you would suddenly remove all the human food sources, that we would see quite a strong decline in the population size there. Yeah, so I hope that answers some of your questions.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure, you're welcome.
Now, Theo.
Yeah, hello, I'm Theo Bakker. I'm emeritus professor in evolutionary ecology in Bonn, Germany. I was also interested in reproduction, so I guess that you cannot say much about it. I was thinking whether the change in encounter rates because of human feeding was also transferring to change in breeding behavior and maybe inbreeding rate in these birds. Do you know anything about the effects of feeding on inbreeding in these situations?
Yeah, I actually don't know too much about this. I mean, I guess in the choughs, what is generally known about their breeding is that actually only a very small proportion of the population usually breeds, probably because suitable nesting sites are just really difficult to find. And then also once individuals breed, apparently their reproductive success is quite low. In terms of fledging success and so on, and so yeah, I wonder if like a different study system would be really really neat, where you could have more information about the reproductive success and potentially even could experimentally manipulate the amounts of supplemental food sources that individuals would receive. So yeah, that's a really, really interesting thought. But yeah, I don't know much about how human food supplementation actually influences inbreeding in populations.
Do you have any idea about the composition of the groups? Are these related, the birds, or are these all unrelated birds?
Yeah, so I'm really keen to look into this, but I haven't done that yet. So we took blood samples with the idea to potentially have a look into this, especially also because they seem to stay quite local. Like when we were putting these GPS transmitters, we were first even a bit disappointed by how little they move around because they really stay quite local. And then also thinking about that they are, of course, to some extent constrained by the mountain range they occur on. So we actually don't know like how far do they even like disperse. We have little information about that. And we started GPS tagging another population as well in Austria that sort of has a larger sort of mountain range available. And I'd be very interested to compare them in terms of the genetic relatedness, because this German population is quite constrained in sort of the mountain space that they have available, and then to reach sort of the next mountain areas. I'm not sure if they would actually move like for such long distances. I don't know, but yeah, I would be curious to know more.
Thank you.
Sure, you're welcome.
Thank you, Theo. Okay, so it's my turn. And well, I have several questions, but I think I'm gonna start with one that sort of caught my attention with the Raven study, where you show it the different food sources and then throughout time. And yes, the peak was kind of cool, but then also the food waste, it's always different. Like throughout the year, it's different. The encounter rates are different with taking into account the confident intervals. And so my question is like, do you think that food waste is actually driving differences in social structure? And then, I don't know, maybe they are doing like different foraging groups depending on the type of food source that they are going to. Maybe I'm reading too much into the data, but I just found that interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely see quite a bit of, first of all, individual variation in how much they're using, first of all, generally human food sources, but then for sure also in the type of food source. So I mean, most of the ravens were, for instance, present at these hunting gut piles, but there were also some that were not, or especially with these territorial ravens, you see a bit of a pattern in terms of if they're close to a wolf pack or something, because then they might tend to be more frequently observed at some of the kills, just because they're sort of next to them, and likely also more dominant towards the non-territorial ones. But yeah, I could definitely imagine that you get these then groups of individuals that sort of specialize on certain food sources and then go there more often than to others. And in terms of these temporal patterns, I mean, I think generally what we see is that they use more the human food sources in winter. But still, why we see sometimes these variations, also for the hunting gut piles, I mean, we see this strong peak in March, and then but then when you look from October, it's also somewhat increasing until December, and then it suddenly drops like in January, and I have no idea why is there this this sudden drop, and I think, yeah, you would just need even more detail in the data, because maybe, you know, hunting activity is just generally more low in January or something. But yeah, I essentially don't know. So just getting more and more complex, you know, the more details or fluctuations you add to these resource components.
Yeah. Well, it would be kind of interesting maybe to look into what's going on with the food waste, because it's definitely interesting to see that it actually differs throughout the year. I mean, probably one month it's like overlapping with other resources, but this one, it was small, but it was like significantly different.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned the winter time, I was wondering indeed if there was I mean, in winter, and now I'm going back to the sharps, the restaurants also put out food, and then the towns put out food as well. What's the difference in the quality between these two? So, I mean, I have the food here in the restaurant. Why on earth I'm gonna go down to the town? It's like so many meters below and then come back. There should be something more than just food.
Yeah. So I think that up on the mountain, it's just not enough for the whole population to in terms of just the quantity, because you essentially have these two mountain restaurants that they really like to use, and so one of them, it's quite a large mountain restaurant, but they don't have a compost pile. So I think here you're sort of restricted in terms of is it warm enough for people to sit outside? And then only during lunchtime, you probably have people sitting outside. So, I mean, in the early morning hours, there will be no one. Whereas this other mountain hut that they frequently used, they also have a terrace where people can sit outside, but they also have a big compost pile behind the house where they can feed the whole time. So this food source is available all the time, but it's just essentially one compost pile. And so I think it's just not enough. But when they go to urban space, you also have compost piles a lot in people's gardens, and then the bird feeders that are just there all the time. And in terms of food quality, it's difficult to say. I mean, I guess they get the best food at the mountain restaurant if they find some food leftovers. But a bird feeder might equally well provide something really profitable for them. So I'm not sure in terms of the quality how it exactly changes. But yeah, maybe it's also one of the reasons why they go down in the early morning hours, because maybe that's the time when there's actually not that much there yet up at higher altitudes. And then because they start going up again around midday, noon. So maybe that's when they know, okay, if there is food up at these mountain restaurants, now is the time to actually go. And I mean, I had a bit of look into this because I thought, because based on behavioral observations, we recorded sort of the departure times at this one urban space. And so I thought maybe they depart earlier if the weather is nice, or maybe on weekends, because then they know there will be a lot of food. But it turns out it's not the case. Unfortunately, there was no pattern there. So yeah, I don't know what predicted then the differences in departure times.
Interesting. Does your GPS tags, do they have accelerometer data?
No, I mean they do, but for this German population, we haven't switched it on yet. And so I was mentioning that we started GPS tagging another population in Austria, and here we do have these odd-bar measures. So every 10 minutes we get these activity measures. So I'm hoping once I get a bit more data that I can
was
look
just
into
thinking
some features
that
there.
you could quantify the energy, or just a proxy of energy expenditure of how much it costs to go down to the town and then coming back, and if that actually makes a difference, or maybe in the long run that's not really worth it. Maybe short term, yes, but then later on not so much, and that would be detrimental to the population, certainly.
Yeah, definitely. That would be interesting. I mean, in terms of flying down, I think it's actually not very costly for them. Like they just move down, and I think they're pretty fast as well. I mean, we don't have too many like detailed data of them sort of moving down, but I think it's like 15 minutes or so, and then they're down. And then flying back up is for sure more costly. But what we see a lot is that when weather conditions are good, that they're using thermals quite a bit. So they will start circling up at some point and then make their way up. So I actually think that these altitudinal trips are not too costly for them. And so I think it's like, even if they don't find enough food down in the urban spaces, it's always worth a trip to just kind of have a look if there's something interesting down there, and then go back up. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. I don't know if there's any question on the YouTube, Lauren, or
I don't see any right now.
okay. Does anyone has any other question to ask Kristina, or maybe?
Yes.
Okay. Go on. Perfect. Yeah.
Like since you mentioned that when it gets too cold, they sort of like move down to the urban areas. How do you see, like, for example, climate change sort of reshaping these communities over the next few decades, for example? As like it would get like maybe like would have like more periods where it's cold compared to now.
Yeah, that's a really good question, how this will sort of develop in the future. And so I think like one main reason why natural food sources are absent is because you get a lot of snow up there at sort of the natural habitat where they spend most of the time. And so I could imagine if you really think of, like warmer climate and thus less snow, that they maybe, decrease these altitudinal movements simply because they find more natural food sources. But yeah, it remains a bit the question of how then the natural food sources cope as well. So maybe we see an increase in these berry bushes that they sort of rely on, and then they can mostly feed on those. Or if it's kind of really warm, then you could also imagine that you have insects or higher abundance of insects available, and that's sort of one of their most favorable food source. And so yeah, you could imagine that they stop these movements eventually. So yeah, that's one scenario I could sort of imagine.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, well, this is pretty cool, Kristina. Very interesting, all of it.
Yeah.
I think there are no more questions. So unless Lauren, do you have a question? Or maybe I just close the YouTube and then we can just chat more informally. So just as a reminder, we still have one more seminar next week for those who are on YouTube. So we hope to see you back next week. Thanks, Kristina.
Sure, you're welcome.